Good morning. We're here to discuss The Big Picture by Sean Carroll. And here we have Pleasure of Doubt, DJ Roush, Harry, and soon to be juggling lessons will be coming on soon. So who wants to start our discussion of The Big Picture?
Got to say, this book's been growing on me as we're going into part two. I think, it's a nice little package of useful arguments, and I think he's pretty nuanced, which I Harry's crumpling very loudly.
Sorry.
Oh, he's very nuanced through these chapters, which I really liked. Like he's very non-dogmatic.
I think that he keeps laying out the arguments for moral realism without accepting it. And the same thing with determinism. His whole poetic naturalism about things. There's a really brilliant diagram. Book's wrong way up. There's a really brilliant diagram that I thought where he's got kind of subjective and objective, and he divides it between the two of them. Where is it? This is the problem with not marking the page and having to find it. Anyway, he puts physics and biology and chemistry on one side, and then I can't remember what he puts on the other, but he puts morals on the other. And I found it really funny because the way that he distinguishes between the two doesn't make any sense if you appeal to his poetic naturalism, which is that we have certain stories that we tell ourselves about things that make things useful. So all the subjective things that come with physics and biology, i.e., the way we couch this within a particular story. So chemistry involves molecules and atoms to a certain level, and then biology above that, and so on and so forth. Morality is just the same in terms of conscious experience, but he doesn't heed to that. And I found it really funny because I thought again that he laid out all the arguments for it, but then didn't make the final step for it.
Did he say precisely that he's a subjective moralist, or like I would almost think he would say objective morality is again a useful layer of abstraction.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought as well.
Yeah.
And he doesn't say that when he's interviewed by Sam Harris, and when he's when we get to the morality bit, I bet he won't say that either. And then this diagram also shows it explicitly, if I can bloody find the thing. And it's so the same with I just find it really funny because I think his whole narrative, I agree with everything that he says pretty much. And then there's just things like last little bits where I would turn it slightly differently. Anyway.
Yeah. Is that where he discusses the planets of beliefs and
that one?
Okay. Oh, yeah. It's over on that page. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
That's page 112.
Okay. Which chapter is that?
What exists and what is an illusion. It is
13.
Yeah, I've got the online version, so I just have to get to it.
Anyway, he says emergent and effective descriptions, and then under the morality he's got constructed subjective, which I think is actually I'm not really catching that well on the screen.
Well, hold on, because when he means constructed, I think he means social construct, and what he says in one of the chapters here, at least, is that social constructs are still real, and I think to some extent he's saying that therefore they're objective. They're not just subject to whim, an opinion. So I don't know that this diagram, I don't know that being constructed necessarily means not objective, even though he says factual / objective. Constructive, yeah. But I think he's talking about subjective and objective in like morality is subjective in the sense that it occurs in our minds.
Yeah.
But I think it can be derived through reason. Like math is subjective in that way too. So
I don't see a distinction between the. I'm just doing such a bad job holding up for the camera. I don't see a distinction between the physics, biology, and psychology and the morality part of that. So, I think they all have the same flavor of subjectivism to them, that those are the subjects too. Either the subjective choice of
Right.
defining the category as they are, the subjective choice that we should follow logic, that we ought to follow logic in order to understand the world, the subjective choice that we should value things and we should value discovery and understanding the world. That, you know, it all follows from that. And the fact that there is a phenomenon that exists, conscious experience, and then we need to create stories and kind of ideas around that in order to talk about it effectively. So I agree with you in terms of there are subjective elements and there are layers, and he really likes talking about scales of things. And I just don't. He draws a bright line there, and I don't think there is a bright line there.
Yeah, it may just be a flaw in his and he may be just talking about just what it's done. Well, hold on. He puts psychology in the same realm as physics in terms of realness.
This is what I mean, right? So that's why I think that he's got it slightly twisted. I just don't. I think he's so close. He's so close. But when we get to the meaning chapter, I think it will become a little bit more apparent about what he's trying to get at there.
Yeah, no, I agree. That I didn't spend a lot of time looking at that diagram. I should have, but yeah, that diagram is maybe a little off, or at least not very precise.
This is something that DJ picked up on as well last time, which I think was about kind of how he does these. He sometimes switches between saying this is the fundamental reality, physics or whatever, and then also towards this kind of poetic naturalism, which is like we can describe it in different ways. There's no one better way than another. And I found that in different chapters, I don't know how he wrote this book, that he kind of leans one way and then leans the other. And so there's some parts of it, and maybe I just haven't quite understood him properly yet, which is why I get this sense of it. But it's like at one moment he's saying, look, this is just one way of talking about it. We can talk about a wave as in like a wave crashing on the beach. We can talk about the individual particles in the wave. These are just different perspectives and ways to talk about things that are valuable. And then he always seems to reverse that, say, but there is this fundamental level that's a more important way of talking about things. And I'm like, well, you can't have both. You got to decide which is which.
Yeah, I wonder what he's trying to do with poetic naturalism. Like, it seems that poetic naturalism just equals layers of abstraction. That's it. That we can look at we can look at things from different perspectives. You can zoom all the way in, you can zoom all the way out, and we'll call that poetic naturalism. It seems like a strange title. I don't know that it's poetic. It's just the rational way to look at things. You need to look at things. If you want to have a well-rounded view, you have to zoom in at multiple levels, or you're going to be missing.
I think it's recognizing story, right? So I think that's where the poetic steps in. It's saying that the story that we tell ourselves, how we define subjects and how we talk about things, is an essential part of understanding objective reality, if there is such thing as far as we define objective reality. And so that's why I see the objective. That's why I see the poetic come in. Is that he's saying, no, look, stories are a really important part of understanding the world around us and how we navigate effectively and how we pick up and how we create value. And that's the poetic side of things. So I suppose it's basically just trying to boo-hoo this idea that science can only be talked about using mathematical equations and the very fundamental level. He's saying that there are different levels and they're all worthwhile, and these levels contain different types of story associated with them, although there will always be a fundamental underpinning. And I suppose within this part he talks about how those layers interlock with each other, so whether a sub level is kind of within a larger level or whether they slowly start to pull apart. And actually you can get things like where we got a quantum understanding of physics and a higher emergent level of understanding of physics, and those don't meet, and whether that's okay or not. And
he said that it is okay and even necessary, because we don't have access. We can't figure out stuff. If all we look at is that at that micro level, we're going to miss all this stuff at the macro level.
Do any of you guys have Sam Harris's app Waking Up?
Yeah, I've got it, though I don't use it as much as I should. But yeah, I do.
So there's a series of meditations by Richard Lang on there called The Headless Way. And so this perspective that Sean's talking about is it fits so perfectly with this line of inquiry of meditation, which is that you have a look at what you experience, and what you experience, you realize is you have no head, and actually on top of your shoulders is the whole of reality. and then you do a bunch of funny experiments where you only accept what you can see, so you become completely solipsistic, and so you realize that actually you don't have a head. What you see is your like hand moving towards this space, and then a touching sensation, but you don't realize you have a head. So it kind of goes through some very strange exercises, and it's supposed to pull you completely into the present moment of what you observe. And
Right.
I find the inquiry of accepting what you see and understanding through story, and then at the base level, it's just a perfect kind of wrapped up little package between the two. And I found it funny that there was a connection there between what I was reading and then what I was experiencing during meditation.
Well, yeah, when narrative is so important in communication, everything's narrative. All of our communication is narrative. Without we like to downplay it as subjective, but it's not. We tell stories in order to communicate, and especially when it comes to scientific or these difficult topics, without doing it without narrative, make it inaccessible to most people.
Yeah.
So, what do you guys think of the chapter on accepting uncertainty? Where in the first paragraph he says, "Science never proves anything."
That's my one. That's my bread and butter. When we talk about kind of trying to understand a phenomenon that I'm studying, and I do an experiment, and then I talk about it, I'm always couching stuff in that this is what we know so far. So we can only cancel out in this particular scenario. We have observed this, and so it really appeals to both my professional side of myself and my personal side of myself. And I found that the way that he talks about, I find Bayesian probability, I think, is kind of, it's a little bit esoteric and stuff. I much prefer the street epistemology of just confidence level, and they match really, really well. So the idea that you have confident levels, you probably shouldn't have a 0% and probably shouldn't have 100%, and that those confidence levels should shift according to evidence, and you should discover what that evidence is. And so the way that Peter Boghossian talks about confidence levels is a much more accessible way to get at this idea that we have different levels of certainty. It's not binary, our understanding of the world.
I haven't listened to Peter Boghossian, but I think one thing that it's important, and I think linking it to Bayesian statistics sort of helps, is that your confidence level isn't just how much you believe something. It should be somewhat objective. It should be based on reliable criteria that get you there. So just to where a scientist says, and I'm not a scientist, but says I have a high confident result, they mean it's been produced through reliable, repeated, observations that stand up, not just like, I have a hypothesis and I really, really believe in it. That's not what we mean by confidence. So we just have to be careful. I think that's where his use of sort of layman's version of Bayesianism was helpful to me, because I don't understand Bayesianism that much. But I like the way he sort of brought it in and said that, okay, well, you have to, in real life, we're not going to be able to just we're not going to assign the grains of sand and figure out calculations on the fly. Yeah. But we can think of certain principles of, okay, well, how much does this support this hypothesis versus that hypothesis? And I found it interesting, for example, if and this is weird though, if a bit of evidence is compatible with two different hypotheses, but more compatible with one over the other, it should be deemed as evidence more in favor of the first, that one, than the one that it's less compatible with. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Which is sort of very counterintuitive in the sense that, I've always thought if evidence supports both hypotheses, when you see it, it doesn't support one over the other. Now he's saying it sort of does. Now I'm not sure about that. Like in the sense that, for example, there's a version of theism that has evolution compatible with theism. Now, evolution is probably more compatible with the hypothesis of non-theism. But what he would seem to say is, well, because we see evolution, it supports atheism and doesn't support theism, or is an argument against theism. And that seems Now, it's very counterintuitive at the very least. I don't know if I accept that.
So I think that this is maybe in his very final part of that part of the part that we're just reading. So there's a bit where he talks about what's likely, theism or or kind of an atheistic worldview, and what we'd expect within a theistic worldview and what we'd expect in a non-theistic worldview or an atheist worldview. And he talked about the problem of evil and how we'd find a consistency in scriptures across the world. So he talks about what we'd expect between the two. And he actually, this part of the book is pretty much the same as what he talks about when he's debating William Lane Craig, I think. And he talks about what we'd expect to see if there was a God, and what's likely to crop up. And it's pretty much the same chapter verbatim that he does in the debate. And he says, if there isn't a God, we'd probably expect things to be a bit more random, a bit more chaotic. We wouldn't expect us to be the center of the observable universe in any sense of the word. We'd expect there to be much more pain and suffering. We'd find it difficult to find value in the world. We expect there to be evolution. We expect there to be a lack of miracles, etc. So he goes through this list, and then he goes through what we expect in a theistic world. So he says maybe something a bit more simpler, something a connection between all the different religions across the world, and so on and so forth. He lists a whole bunch of stuff, and so I found that very interesting in terms of the way that he lays out the kind of the probability of what you'd see within each. Of course, that's going to change according to what you believe in theistically. So if you believed in some kind of a devil that made it very tricky to find value in the world, then that's
what I
going
was thinking too. He used theism, but he was really referring to classical theism. He was a very particular version of God that's omnibenevolent, the omni three. But if you believe, there could be a deity out there who is not omnibenevolent and who is just as morally ambiguous as the rest of us, right? And there, none of those things would hold up for that hypothesis, or maybe, or at least most of them wouldn't hold up. But,
so what I find is, if we were to make a hypothesis, and so evidence could go either way for either hypothesis, what we do in science is then we'd create an experiment which would exclude one over the other. So we'd put in a control that says that, so if we'd expect to see hypothesis A to be true, then we'd find X. And if we'd expect hypothesis B to be true, then we expect to find Y. So although we do often these kind of things crop up where it could be, it could be X, Y, or Z, that could be a possible reason, a mechanism why it's the case. That then just encourages us to create an experiment to explicitly exclude one of those ideas. And so you often don't, it's very rare to find a high confidence in lots of different hypotheses, because very quickly, scientists would just rule them out one by one.
It's all Harry and me, guys. What, Mark and DJ, what do you guys
I'm thinking most religious claims are not subject to experiment, and these likelihoods of what is more likely under theism or atheism, that seems to be a subjective assignment of probability as well. So your entire Bayesian calculation is subjective.
Which is why I think he has to say, you have to specify the type of God that you're thinking of first. I think, for example, a deistic God who just created the universe, maybe not even voluntarily, and then does nothing else, I think would look identical to an atheistic world, right? So how would you tell the difference in that kind of sense?
He cuts out,
that's the point. Sorry.
Yeah. He cuts out. He says, No. He cuts out. He says, cut out what's unnecessary. So if the world could exist, with all unicorns existing on Saturn or without unicorns existing on Saturn, if we could have both those worldviews and everything could be explained, but you've just added in unicorns, take out the unicorns. It's important to reduce what we do know rather than just adding in a load of extra shit. I think that's.
And this is where the things that we have not yet explained become ammunition for the theist, right? Because they say, well, you can't explain X, Y, and Z, and therefore, but we have an explanation for it.
Yeah. What they have is a hypothesis.
Hypothesis.
Yeah.
And you asked Mark about what about science not proving anything. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Harry. Yeah, a lot of people misunderstand proof, and I think it's the legal system's fault because the legal system talks about proof in a very different way, and they talk about burden of proof and proof beyond reasonable doubt and all that. People apply that concept to scientific terms, but science uses proof very differently, where they limit it to things like math and logic, deductive proofs versus evidence and abductively figuring out the best scenario. But I mean, I've always had an issue with abduction, but he talks about abduction like we want to do more than just have the best theory before we say something's believed, because the best theory may still be pretty bad, may be pretty unreliable. So abduction has to be more, to be useful, has to be more than just saying we want to go with the best. It has to, the best has to have a certain standard of confidence level before we say, we're willing to go with it. But maybe that's just baked in, but he didn't mention that. But I've always had an issue of let's just go with the best, because then you can just say, okay, we have 3 hypotheses. They're all pretty unreliable, but one's a little bit more reliable than the rest. So that's what we're going with. I mean, there are times where you have to, for example, now during the coronavirus, if they have something that looks like a cure, maybe we don't wait till we get the greatest level of certainty before we start rolling stuff out, because we have to just try stuff. But in terms of when you're able to slow down and figure stuff out, just going with the best possible, the best currently known hypotheses doesn't seem like itself a great policy, without saying best, but also we need a reasonably high level of confidence before we say, yeah, we're going with it. Otherwise, it's just interesting.
So once you come up with a theory, you can test it further, right? So you don't have to stop at abduction. Once you decide which one you're going to pick, then you continue to test it through experiment.
Yeah, like I would say abduction helps you zero in on the best one, but you should always be looking at like the few top best ones and keep on working at it until it reaches a high confidence level, and then you can say it warrants belief. So I think that's what you were getting at. Is that?
Well, and like what you were saying is how you decide what is best. So one way you decide what is best is what is simplest, like Occam's razor. Another way to decide what is best is what has the widest scope of being able to predict things. So like he keeps talking in the book about quantum field theory, because it seems to have wide applicability. It's widely applicable to nature as we know it.
Or you take a look at string theory, which a lot of researchers are pretty excited about, but from what we understand, or what I understand, there's very little actual confirmed, actual research that's been able to test it out. So we could say it's really interesting, and maybe it's the best we know right now, but would we say, okay, therefore we should believe it? Probably not. It's probably not ready for belief yet until they're able to figure out how to confirm it in some way, even if it's really good otherwise.
Right, because what predictions does it make that you can test? So far it's just a way of trying to organize what we know. But it's string theory making predictions, that we can verify through experiment.
Or, I mean, we could abductively have the best theory be able to make very few predictions and then say, well, it's the best theory. Should we go with it? Well, no, it doesn't let us do much with it.
What is it that makes it the best? I mean, you could go with simplest.
Mm-hmm.
God causes and controls everything. Is that a very simple theory? You've got just basically one thing that affects everything in the universe.
But simple is hard. I mean, because there's different ways of saying simple. I mean, a being that exists just by its very nature and creates things. I mean, that sounds pretty simple. So it is a universe always having existed and doing things. That sounds simple too. I mean, you could say the God is one, but the universe existing, you need a whole bunch of things always having existed, because the universe is made up of other stuff. So it's hard to say, like, how do you decide? I think people tend to misuse Occam's razor, which is, I think, designed to compare similar hypotheses, but where you've just added stuff in. But a lot of nature doesn't have a duty to be simple. I mean, we like simpler theories, but sometimes more complicated theory is the right one.
So that's a good question. Like, how do we justify using Occam's razor? How do we justify preferring simpler theories? Is it simply that we're looking for things that can help us calculate, and if a theory is too complicated, we can't make use of it? Or is it that we find that nature seems to have underlying simplicity to it? So it's almost an inductive argument of, because we found so many simple theories so far, we expect that there are going to be more simple theories in the future.
And going back to your God example, the very simple idea of surrounding God, I guess the problem with that one would be it is simple, but it doesn't give us any predictive power. We can't predict what's going to happen just with that theory alone. But that's not an argument. That's an argument against it, but it's not using the simplicity.
But neither can we predict anything from just saying the universe in some form or another just has always existed in some way we don't know. So what predictions do we get from that, other than the stuff is there to expand, for example, at one point in the Big Bang, versus a being exists who somehow created this stuff. I don't know that Occam's razor really helps. Here's how I see Occam's razor. It's a rule of thumb. It is not designed to solve problems. It's designed to help guide you in hypothesis formation. But I think we run into difficulties with it when we say, well, this is simpler, so this one must be right. I think that's dangerous.
Another thing I was thinking as I was reading through the book is he puts a lot of emphasis on science and experience and mathematics, and but I think most of what we believe is things that we've been told. We don't have first-hand knowledge of any of this scientific stuff, really, except for Harry, maybe. And
that's a very small part of the natural world that I understand of seen.
Right. So it comes down to whose story do you believe? And everybody's telling stories to each other. And do you trust this group of scientists, or do you trust this group of religious leaders?
I think that picks up on the idea that
Juggling's there.
that we trust the one that we can check and have a look at. So when we do get particularly curious, or something does seem actually particularly extraordinary, we can then go and have a look and actually go and look beyond the hedge to see whether there is a unicorn standing there, rather than just taking it for granted. So that's why the scientific method is so popular, is because everyone can check it, and it has so many checks and balances in place that if I don't want to take someone's word for it, I can go and check that. And in fact, within the scientific community, you get kudos for proving other people wrong, for going against the grain and proving that you've got something unique or different. And when you have an attitude and a culture like that, it means that I'm just getting distracted by the sounds of chickens in the background.
Should I mute?
No, it's quite lovely, okay. Actually. I think that compared to, let's say, a faith-based, which is that just trust me, don't look yourself. In fact, I'm going to discourage you from trying to disprove what I'm saying. It's saying, no, come on, we accept the challenge. We've tried our hardest to come up with the best theory. Let's see what you come up with. And within that spirit, it means that we can, although we have to accept, we have to trust what these people are saying. We don't have to go the whole hog and take it for granted. If we wanted to, we could go and do our homework and check it. And that, I think, is the power of the scientific method.
But I think if you talk with somebody who is religious, they would say that they are doing their homework. Like it's a way for them to make sense of the experience they have in their lives and the experience of their friends and their family, the people around them who they trust.
Yeah.
And so it does make sense to them.
And I'd like to just say that within science, because it's so layered, there are so many parts of what I do that I don't understand and I just accept for granted. Like I run my samples through a GC, through a gas, using gas chromatography. I don't understand how that instrument comes up with the numbers that it comes up with. I just trust that the instrument's working and the technician knows what they're doing. And so there's so many different aspects within that kind of chain that I'm doing, and when I'm doing science, that actually there are parts of it where I'm just trusting that these things are working in accordance. And if they, if the controls look okay and the standards look okay, I just accept that the data's right. I can't.
And hence the problem of replication in science, right?
right. And so you have to. So we have we do controls, we do replicates, we have standards. We get people to repeat the experiment. We repeat the experiment ourselves, in order to be certain. But there's always this degree of I'm just trusting what's going on here, and
well, yeah. There's some look. In the ideal world, I guess we would all go out and individually research everything, but that's not practical.
Yes.
But we do know that some people are, and we do know that we could go out and do it ourselves. Now, so to some extent, we have to put our faith, so to speak, in the people who are doing that. And every once in a while, you've got to check in to see are they really doing their job.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true.
Now, Juggling, since you just joined us, I'd like to hear what you have to say. And don't let your chicken interrupt you too much.
Which part?
Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Just thought
no, I know. I almost would start from the top and say string theory and MWI, multiple worlds interpretation, are both on the same epistemological footing in that there's nothing that rules them out. Neither is there anything that we could, even in theory, given our machinery, visibility, to determine whether it's correct or not.
Right.
They're both conjecture.
We can't use empiricism to figure out which is more correct.
Right. So, I just sit back and go, okay, till I don't know. I mean, until I know, it's just a conjecture. It's an interesting thing, but I shouldn't base anything on it unless it is likely to lead to something I could test. And that's just I'm very rubber to the road thing.
And I think that even goes back to that's why I find morality being the most fundamental aspect of science, because it's what we value. So, it's how useful something is according to our conscious experience. That's why we like logic and rationality and philosophy and things like that, is because it feels good and creates good conditions within the world. It kind of goes back to this kind of how valuable something is, and that test of how valuable something is how it affects our conscious experience. That is the fundamental structure of which everything is built upon.
So if we had a criteria for accepting, for allowing medical drugs into the marketplace that was so rigorous that we expected a 99.999% confidence level instead of a more reasonable one, we could decide against that kind of criteria based upon morality, meaning that people would needlessly suffer and die under a more rigorous burden of proof than a less rigorous one, right? So in some, what you seem to be saying is that if we bring morality into science, it can help us decide between an unrealistic standard for accepting proof, or not a burden of proof or weight of the evidence, versus a more realistic standard. And the reason why we would choose the more realistic standard is because of the real world effects it would have on suffering and dying and so on, right?
Yeah, I think that science is always value laden in the sense that we have finite resources, so we have to decide what's more valuable. That's where our funding comes from. Our funding body says, we want to search this because it is most valuable, and then scientists write a grant for it and try and get the money. So that is exactly from the get-go. We're already cutting the cake in a certain way to make it more enjoyable. So yeah, I just think that even blue sky science is done because we think it's going to come up with something, or because it's enjoyable, or because there's something down the road for it. There is so little. On top of my head, I can't think of an example where in science where we haven't done something because there is some benefit, or someone said that we should do this because of X. So it is all value laden in that sense of the word. In the sense that it's to do with us.
Finbox Dictators in chat says, no, morality has nothing to do with science, except how it should be used. But now, when you're saying value, are you equating value with morality? I would think morality is a subset of value, any kind of value. So the values that you're talking about, I mean, some of them may be moral values, which I think in terms of just how we deal with each other. But just something being useful, does that make it a moral value? Like if something's useful for building cars, does that make it moral? I mean, I don't tend to think of that in terms of moral. I think morals in terms of just how we deal with one another.
Okay, sure. So the way I'm looking at this particular thing is I'm looking at morality in terms of how it affects our conscious states. So I assume that I have various different states of feeling good and feeling bad, and there's a spectrum there to be had. So pain and suffering on one end, and misery on one end, and gratification, feeling lovely and content and resilient on the other. And when we discover things about the world and about and how to act, and the knowledge within the world is going to move us on that within that spectrum. So it's either going to push us towards having more lovely and content experiences or less lovely and content experiences. And so it is a moral landscape in the Harris sense of the word, because there are things that are only tiny blips and would barely affect kind of the nature of what's going on. But there are lots of peaks and troughs within that landscape. There are lots of hills and valleys and mountains, and we want to climb up to the mountains and try and get out of the valleys and the pits. And so, for instance, discovering the combustion engine, we could argue out how that has advanced society and whether that's been helpful or not. But it's all within this idea of how valuable has it been to humanity. So how has it managed to reduce our suffering? How has it managed to advance society?
But would you say that I think like what Thinbox is getting at is does morality more come in the motives? Why are we choosing to study this? And what are we going to do with this once we figure out the results? But in the process itself of science, morality doesn't seem to play as much of a role.
Well,
we're getting away from the book, but that's fine.
No, I don't think we are, because this is a really important distinction that Carroll tries to get at and stuff, and I just don't think it's there. So the is-ought distinction, we ought to follow logic in order to understand the world around us. I can't convince you to do that. It's just an ought. So there's so many, the crossover within science, with the way I see the values, we value science because it helps bring about certain goodness in the world. We wouldn't value it if it didn't give us truth. And if that truth wasn't helpful.
It doesn't have to be practical. It could just be that we're curious and we want more knowledge.
Right. It could be that, yeah.
And that's something that we value. That's a goal that we have. So this idea of something being useful, that sounds more like you're talking about the means. And for something having value, you're talking about the ends. So they both kind of work together. Usefulness is the means to an end. Value is the end that you value, that you're striving for.
Yeah, I just, is it technically moral? Like we can value things that are immoral, right? I could value hurting somebody, for example, but you wouldn't call me moral. You would say you're immoral for that. But that's
still within morality, though, right? You're talking about the axioms of good and bad, and how we're going between those.
We could value things that are neither moral nor immoral. Like, is curiosity moral or immoral?
Right. So on the landscape, there are some things that are just an anthill or a little pebble or a tiny dip in the road. So they're neither here or there. They don't really matter. Whether I eat chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream probably has it doesn't really matter that much. It's not that much of a moral issue. It's still part of that landscape because everything is couched in the sea of value.
In terms of the landscape is value, and morality is a subset of that, of the landscape of value. Not every value we have is related to morality, but our moral values are a subset of the whole. Does that?
So you can disagree with me, of course, and I would say that all our values are couched within what I would term some kind of morality, because the way that we should judge our values on how they bring about our own happiness and the happiness of others, or how they increase or decrease the suffering of ourselves and others around us. And so that's all ethical argument. That's all within the moral realm.
So if we value curiosity, it's because it makes us happy? Is that what you're getting
Right.
at, Harry?
Or it brings us some value. Yeah.
I value zinc applied to prop shafts because it provides for a minimization of rust on or destruction of the prop. Does that apply?
In what do you mean? How does that apply? Does that apply to what?
I'm just giving you a value that I have. I like to see
Okay.
good zincs on prop shafts on boats. But does
Okay.
that have a moral application?
I don't know. Maybe it has little to no moral application. Maybe it's one of those things which is just kind of like I said, basically flat land. It doesn't really matter either way.
Okay.
Is that for its aesthetic value, or is it because it's helping to protect it in some way?
Minimization of corrosion on the propeller, upon the metal parts of the boat.
So you could keep asking questions about that, like why do you
Sure.
want to minimize corrosion? And eventually you get down to some core values about
Right.
your
The boat lasts
relationship with your
longer.
boat.
It's cheaper to operate.
Yeah. And I'd argue there are objectively wrong values as well. This would come back to my moral realism, where there are values which you say are good, but they are not good. They increase suffering, and they don't result in a conscious state that's nicer.
Putting a magnesium on there with a zinc, and then the magnesium goes away, and your zincs are in great shape. Not great. Magnesiums are more expensive than zincs, by the way.
People with the wrong zinc. Like, I think we should just do away with those people.
Which could be a bad value, because the way that we're dealing with a moral situation ends up with more suffering than in the first place.
Now,
What do you guys think? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I didn't realize until reading Sean Carroll's book that there were people who opposed this super collider because they felt it would create a black hole.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
But we could never prove that they were wrong. So there's probably people still out there believing that.
There are several things. I think there were I can't remember all of them. Some of them were to do with some like weird physical phenomenon which would create like these long, I can't even remember what they were. There were like 3 or 4 like main worries, including a black hole being created that people had. But of course, being scientists, they didn't give the colloquial certainty that people wanted. They just gave a scientist's answer of probability, which people hate.
Aren't there higher energy collisions going on all the time with cosmic rays? If people are worried about this stuff, it's already happening.
That was their argument. That was the physicists were saying we observe this in the universe all the time, including in our upper atmosphere and stuff, and it doesn't suddenly create a black hole.
Although I'm not sure if his point that, should we just worry about improbable things? I think, should be just shrugged off. I mean, in most cases it's true, but if destruction of the universe is one of the options, we do have to give it a little bit more consideration than some random other unlikely thing.
And that's where he came up with that hypothetical about you opening a spaghetti jar,
I love
a jar of spaghetti sauce that would end just kill everybody, right? It would be immoral for you to open that jar of spaghetti sauce under those circumstances.
No matter how good the spaghetti is going to taste with it on.
And maybe that's going back to what you were saying, Mark, about, there is a thing as being too skeptical and requiring too much of a burden of proof, at which point it just becomes unwieldy and you can't live like that in a practical sense.
Right. Well, that's why the traditional, the old, the Perrowian skeptics, were using knowledge in a certain, at a level of certainty, which I think is not a very useful definition of knowledge. I agree we can't be certain of most things, but we don't need that level we don't need certainty to function in life most of the time. So, justified true belief, I think, is a much more reasonable definition of knowledge than certainty with no chance of being wrong.
again, and I think the street epistemology approach of how we think about our confidence levels and how that relates to the world and whether we're justified in our confidence are really, really valuable conversations. And I would argue less esoteric than the idea of approaching something with Bayesian probability and having a maths equation on paper, but simply asking someone's confidence level about something, their priors, as Carroll would say, and then seeing how they would adjust according to evidence is a really nice way for people to understand whether they have justified beliefs or not. And of course, whether you yourself have justified beliefs. So if you speak to someone who's a good street epistemologist, they should be able to tease out your particular epistemology, and then you should be able to understand it a little bit better.
I think.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I know. I was just going to say I found it really clever of him to, a lot of the time when Bayesianism comes up when talking about religion, the non-theist will assign this very low prior probability to theism, and then the theists object. Now, he was very clever in assigning a 50-50 chance for atheism and theism, because he's making the point, which is, from what I understand, but it's much more intuitive when he does it his way, that it doesn't really matter what your priors are. They're just a starting point. So it doesn't matter that they're subjective. They're subjective in a way that doesn't hurt the objective nature of Bayesianism. It's what happens after you set your priors that changes it. So I think that's a very clever way. And anytime going forward, when somebody objects to assigning a prior probability of 0 point whatever for theism, just say, okay, well, revamp it at 50-50 and see what happens then.
Well, do you think that when he raised that he was onto something when he raised near the end of that chapter about the problem of good for the atheist? In other words, the atheist usually presents to the theist the problem of evil, but the theist can always present to the atheist the problem of good. In other words, how did we get so much goodness and so much so much human compassion out of a randomly determined, unguided evolution? Do you think that was a compelling? I realize Sean Carroll himself is not persuaded by this argument, but I wonder if you felt that it was persuasive at all.
It is a common response, isn't it?
It's a good question. I think there's an answer, which is that it's consciousness. It's like Harry's been talking about. It's our capacity for suffering and not suffering, and then going to well-being. That because we have this range of between absolute suffering and say absolute bliss, and we have the capacity to empathize with other people, and plus we need other people. It seems normal. It doesn't seem out of the ordinary that. Once you have conscious beings who are capable of looking ahead, so we call them moral agents. They're intelligent enough to predict what's going to happen from their behavior. They're an agent enough that they can make choices and enact those choices. Once we have beings that are capable of suffering and feeling what suffering is, able to empathize with other people, it seems to make sense, and that good would come out as well as bad. I think a universe in which there was only suffering or only good would be less believable to me than one when there's both. Once you have the capacity for suffering and not suffering.
If there were a universe where there were only good, then the concept of good kind of loses its meaning. I mean. There's no point in describing something if there's no alternative. You don't even think to make the description.
Yes and no. I see it more as a continuum with a zero at the middle. For example, I think you can have a bunch of good things. One thing being more good, so to speak, not good English, but one thing being gooder than the other. But that doesn't mean the one that's slightly less good is bad. I think there's sort of a metaphorical zero line where you move from, okay, here's the good side, here's the bad side. And so you could have a universe where all conscious creatures suffered all the time. I mean, you can imagine a universe like that, and that would be a terrible universe. That would be, the worst possible universe would be, a universe where every conscious being suffered maximally for their entire existence, or for eternity. That would be the worst thing you can imagine. And we can imagine that. And we can imagine a universe where whatever conscious beings don't get suffering. They don't suffer, but they have varying levels of pleasure. So I think you can have both.
I think you still need the scale though. So I think what I see DJ picking up there is that we have the comparison. So when I think about good and bad, actually I do just think of a scale system, like between black and white. And so if we only ever saw in white for some reason, or if black didn't exist as a color, then there would be no need to talk about black. You're talking about it from our perspective, that we understand that those creatures could you've already introduced the scale when you say they maximally suffer, because that suggests that there is an alternative in which they couldn't maximally suffer, a universe that we have right now, for instance.
Yeah, but I guess the only point I'm making is like a universe where we didn't have the suffering qualia and we only had varying degrees of pleasure qualia. I don't think they would suddenly say at the low end of the pleasure qualia, oh my God, that's absolutely terrible. That should never happen. You should never be at the low level of pleasure. Whereas, if we were in suffering, suffering, I think there's some objective, it may be different for each person. Like what's suffering for you may be different than for me, but there's some objective level where I can say I am suffering versus not suffering. And, so we can say there's varying degrees of suffering and varying degrees of well-being. Yeah. Without saying they cross necessarily. This is a nuance. It's a subtle distinction. I don't think we're agreeing. Yeah. We're disagreeing too much there.
No. Let's just stop picking at it. It's not worth it. Yeah. It's really not.
Yeah. If I'm on a timeline where I have suffering in one direction and pleasure in the other direction, and they're on the same timeline, that means there should be some conversion between the units where this amount of suffering moves me this far and this amount of pleasure moves me the same amount backwards. So they would balance, and I would accept this amount of pain for this amount of pleasure. And I think that's not the reality. I think people have a very, very different tolerance for how much soreness in a workout is worth the pleasure of the result. Things like that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that pain and pleasure are even on the same axis in our brains. Like, aren't we talking about different receptors? I mean, could you even have both experiences simultaneously? Yeah. Masochistic in some way?
Definitely. I hang out with a lot of people in that crowd that like that sort of thing.
But that's still...
But that's why you use suffering, not pain. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so my understanding of that is that the pain is pleasure in terms of the stimuli crossed over. They can still experience pain and suffering. It's just that the way that it's the terms for them are different according to their biology and their past experience.
Okay.
Well, but they could have pain, but it's not causing them suffering. So the pain is giving them pleasure. That's why I think suffering is better than pleasure. And well-being is better than, say, happiness. That in terms of the terms we use, because suffering can be different for you or me, but we could each be suffering in different ways, but equivalently suffering, right? It's just different. It's just whatever is suffering for us is suffering. It's still bad for us.
Yeah. So Frank Oskaszewski, the guy the book that we read before, who wrote the 5 Invitations book before this, would do the difference between pain and suffering in terms of pain is something that's an essential part of our experience. We cannot avoid pain, but suffering is something we can avoid because it's something that we kind of doll upon with resistance and the way that we think about things. So that's another way of thinking about it.
So you can choose to suffer less even if your external circumstances don't change at all. Is that right, Harry?
Yeah. It'd be the placebo and the nocebo within the experience.
I'm not sure if it's a pure choice, but I think there are things you can do to help yourself suffer less. There are maybe techniques you can use that result in you suffering less. But if we could just choose, it'd be nice. Okay, I choose not to suffer. Bam. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it is kind of a frame of mind, right?
Yeah. Stoicism and things like that the way that you think about something will reduce the amount of suffering that's associated with the particular circumstance. Meditative practice, there are certain things that we can do, so the way that we approach our own minds and our own circumstances, they don't cause excess worry and anxiety and needless pain.
I realize we haven't finished the book yet, but I'm wondering how much would Sean Carroll agree with John Vervaeke? Do you think he's writing this book to fill in the void to deal with a crisis of meaning to some extent? Do you think Sean Carroll kind of sees that with a fading of religious belief, that there's a crisis of meaning, and he thinks his book is going to play a small part in filling that?
I definitely think so. I think the whole poetic naturalism is exclusively designed to address that. I think the only reason I can think of for him using that term is to help inject meaning into naturalism.
Or as DJ says, you just add poetic on because it sounds beautiful and nice.
Yeah, I think it's weasel
exactly. No, I agree in a way, but that being said, it's not quite. It's not like he's saying He's saying it's okay to think of these things. Naturalism should not mean. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Naturalism should not just mean let's just talk about particles bumping into each other. That's important. That you can be a naturalist and still say there's love, there's beauty, there's consciousness, there's morality, and that it's important to look at things on the macro scale and study them scientifically too. So that, like the eliminativists, I think he's taken a few shots at them throughout this book, against eliminativism. I think he finds that sort of a much less meaning driven ontology for naturalism.
I think he's defending his worldview, and one of the common criticisms of naturalism is that it's cold and sterile and devoid of meaning.
And it shouldn't be, is he's saying. He's saying it shouldn't be that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good point. We don't, to say that we can think of things on the level of molecules and particles doesn't mean none of this other stuff is quote unquote real. And that it's not useful to have a purely eliminativist view. That doesn't get us. It's eliminating a whole bunch of narratives that are very valuable to us. And what's the point of that? I mean, the whole point, this is where I guess I agree with Harry. The whole point of figuring all this stuff out is not just to have some cold, dead, meaningless view of things. It's to help us understand things, to help us function better in the world. I mean, it can be you. It's just like, if my iPhone is broken, then it's really important to know what all the transistors do and all the things in there do to fix it. But otherwise, I'm just using my iPhone. It's useful to me to use it. I don't need to think about it in terms of what's going on underneath the hood. It is useful for me to think about it on a macro level, even though you could think about it purely on on a software hardware type level.
I mean, you could do science which was very unhelpful. So you could discover ways of how to make nuclear technology accessible to everyone, so that they could build their own nuclear bomb, or how to manipulate and genetically modify viruses and make it 3D printable. And there are many different ways, and we might still be heading in that direction already. I mean, we might end up creating a technology in the next 50 years that ends up with the devastation of humanity. And so, we don't do science to understand the world. We do science to understand the world in a way that makes it better for ourselves.
And if you're a pure mathematician, you might be doing it just out of curiosity, not for any application.
Yeah. Or any obvious application.
Well, I still think mathematicians are hoping. I think they're still hoping something useful comes out of it, right? They're probably not just.
Maybe not. It's just
like
intrinsically beautiful. There's an aesthetic component to it, or the pleasure of figuring things out. And
maybe it falls into the category of art there. So it's kind of this thing where it's fun for the person to do. It's aesthetically pleasing. There is something about that exercise in which that person enjoys. So the value is to themselves there. Then
They're just trying to get laid.
I mean, is that a best way to get? That sounds like a very terrible way to go about doing
Yeah.
that.
No.
Do you have to
In some crowds.
write it on cocktail napkins? I wouldn't know. My maths is too poor.
Yeah, you can almost see it the equivalent in maybe an artist, somebody who paints picture, who paints, but he never shows his paintings to anybody but himself. He just wants to observe what he's done. Doesn't really want to be famous. Just wants to, see what he could accomplish and leave it at that. That's kind of maybe what I'm sure a mathematician wants to show his proofs to other people, but there's something similar there.
There's something quite important here, which is that the hobbies we pick up is tangent, but kind of if we try and externalize our happiness, then things become very difficult because we're looking for the approval in others in order to be happy, which is pretty chaotic and not necessarily certain. But if it's an intrinsic happiness, so we're doing it for ourselves, it doesn't require us to show other people. It's the process itself that gives us happiness. That we're much more likely to find a content and wonderful hobby, something that brings us joy. And so I really admire people who do have hobbies like that, in which it doesn't matter either way whether I show this to someone. What matters is the process and the enjoyment of the task itself.
Well, we've spent a little over an hour now, so I'm wondering how much longer we can go and whether or not we should wrap things up. And do we want closing statements from each of you?
Trying to see
or do you want to respond to anything that Thinbox Dictator is typed in the chat? That's another possibility. I'm not trying to rush you guys, but
yeah, let's respond.
Not clear how to see the chat.
Yeah, where is the chat?
On the YouTube channel. Here I can post a link. Hold on. There, I posted a link. Wait, I posted in the private chat. Do you guys see that?
Yeah.
Or do I have to? Yeah. Okay.
Juggling, have you seen the Vanessa videos from Magna Bosco?
Yes.
Recently?
Oh my gosh. I so love them. And I pulled quotes from, I got quotes out of number 2. There weren't any good quotes in number 1. And I haven't pulled the quotes from number 3. I'm just very, very happy with them.
The number 3 I thought was the best. Like, he tied everything together. He's such a good. I know he's supposed to be very good, but he is very good.
Yeah. Oh wow.
It's
what
like
a
watching.
tightrope.
I know. What a tightrope. I mean, for those who haven't watched it and who do like street epistemology, there's a video that's recently come out. A set of 3 videos actually, and then one diagnosis video that Anthony Magna Bosco does, where he does street epistemology, and he's doing this with this particular young woman who believes in a certain type of social theory and things like that, and he just does and basically moral relativism and a kind of a subjective understanding of truth, and he does an amazing job at not getting caught into the usual pit traps, making sure that he doesn't end up kind of, I suppose, falling into name calling or anything like that, and instead of really sticking close to what she actually believes in, and he keeps bringing her on track. It's an incredible, if you want to know how to have a good conversation, he does just such a good job at what is a very sticky conversation.
Oh, do you know what? If you click on live comments, all the YouTube comments are there.
If you go to YouTube.
Oh yeah. So you got private chat.
Yeah.
So you got private chat on the right hand side of your screen. If you click live comments there.
Yeah, I'm afraid if I pull up another feed, I'm gonna kill my bandwidth.
No, it's just it's part of the Streamlabs. So if you look just to the right of the screen where you see us, not StreamYard, I'm sorry. You see 2 tabs, private chat, where I put in the link to the video, and then live comments. So you can see all the comments from the chat. You can't respond here. I think you have to go to YouTube to respond, but you can you can see the conversation. That's very neat.
Are you on PC or Mac?
I'm on Mac.
I'm on
I'm on
Android here, so I don't have.
Oh, maybe you don't have it on the phone.
Oh, yeah.
So that conversation you were speaking about, Harry, is that something I can watch on YouTube?
That is something you can watch on YouTube.
So will you post a link to it at some point?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I think it's an amazing example. It's an amazing example of street epistemology. It's kind of an expert level of street epistemology that you wouldn't normally see for your day to day.
What was it again?
Yesterday. The channel is Anthony Magnabosco.
I'll get it
The
now.
videos are Vanessa. That's the interlocutor, number 1, 2, and 3. And there's he goes through a breakdown video. It takes 30 minutes over about a 14-minute video to step in and talk a lot. I also recommend, if these three really interest you, there's a 2-hour talk between Reed Nicewander and James Lindsay, analyzing the first 2 videos that happened yesterday or the day before on Cordial Curiosity channel.
Oh, cool.
I think I put it in private chat now, so you should be able to. Anyway, is that it in terms of book club?
You know, we could always stop the stream and then go to the voice channel if you want to talk more. If you want to do it that way, what do you think?
Sure.
Or do you guys want to keep the stream going? I can go either way.
Well, let's cut it, because if it's being like no one will want to watch us. I know we've nattered a lot, but let's not natter any more than is necessary.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll end the broadcast, and we can meet up at the voice channel if you'd like. What's up, Juggling?
Before we go, Harry, we really should fix this. You need some rectangular glasses and comb your hair back. We need more forehead. Yeah, that's yes.
Do you want me to put a little scar here as well?
It isn't necessary. You can do that if that helps. But the rectangular glasses, you're out of.
The way my eyesight's going, I'll need them soon anyway, so I'll keep that in mind. All right, guys. Speak in a second, I guess, on the other in the Discord.
I'll see you there,
everyone.